Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unit 9. I am glad you are here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are going to dive into content in just a moment, but first, let's talk a little bit about the schedule for this unit and what kind of assignments you can expect. So, first, so it's Unit 9. Things are due on the 23rd. We're talking about strategic planning. This is part 4 of the strategic planning series. It's about setting your course. We're doing Allison and Kay chapters 9 and 10, and then through the conclusion, and then also Powell and Bromley chapters 21 and 22 for graduate level students. If you have any questions, please reach out and let me know. Another thing to be looking at. You've got the assignments for this week, which include the instructor lecture, which you're watching now, the group presentation for the unit, the discussion board posts for Unit 9, and then the reading quiz for Unit 9, and then Group 2 is putting together their presentation for Unit 10. So that's due for Group 2. Another thing to keep in mind is that the following unit, Unit 10, the first draft of the strategic planning analysis report is due. Excuse me, and this is due on 3/30/2025, right? It's at the end of Unit 10. So please be looking at that, working on that with your group. It's not something that you want to start the week before it's due. It's something you want to be working on well in advance, giving sufficient time for planning and putting it together because it's a big project. So please be working on that with your group now. And if you have questions, reach out to me, okay? Thank you so much. And let's go ahead and look. I've got a small PowerPoint that we're going to use today to kind of guide our discussion. I'm going to share my screen with you in just a second here. Okay, there we go. I'm going to share this, make it a little bigger, and then we're going to present from it so that you can see the full screen. Here we go. All right, that should be showing up. All right, so we're talking about setting your course. So this comes at the towards the end of the book that we've been going through, and towards the end of this whole series on strategic planning. We're moving into more grant writing later and kind of shifting focus just a little bit. But right now, we're continuing to camp out here on this idea of what does it mean to be leading an organization, to be planning strategically, to be looking forward to the future, and creating a roadmap to get there as an organization, a nonprofit organization in particular, right? And this is just a lot of interesting questions here that we've been covering, and I think it's really helpful here to kind of frame the discussion one last time around the questions here that we're talking about, the kind of whole thing that we're digging into, this idea of strategic planning. It's not just for the chief executive of an organization. And I want to make this really clear because many of you I know in the class are undergraduates. Some of you are graduate students. I don't think we have any nonprofit leaders in the class in terms of the position that you're currently in. Now, you may someday be in a position where you are the executive director or the CEO of a nonprofit, and that's wonderful. And so you can use a lot of these things as you go towards that point in your career. But for some of you, that may not be the track you're on. Maybe you're wanting to be in the private sector or in a governmental sector or kind of other pieces where you enjoy volunteering in nonprofits, or you want to be a part of a board, which is not really an executive position, but it is involved in a leadership position, right? And there's a lot of different kind of questions that come up. I think what's so good about having the tools to be able to engage in strategic planning for a nonprofit is that you start to see the inner workings of it and you start to understand who has responsibility for what inside of a nonprofit organization. And then it also, in some ways, it gives you a little bit of ownership in how things work too, because you suddenly start to understand behind the curtain what's going on. And that gives you a certain amount of responsibility, but also a certain amount of knowledge as you go into these organizations. Even let's say if you're graduating undergrad right now and you start out in a nonprofit, um, you can start to see some of the things that are helpful and important for a healthy nonprofit. and you can do your best to help contribute those things to your organization, right? I've been in a lot of nonprofits that are small, kind of everybody's on a shoestring budget. You kind of have to, everybody chimes in and helps to make things better. And even early on in my career, there were a lot of opportunities to be able to bring something that's helpful to the table. And I think that strategic planning is probably it's one of the most important toolboxes we can bring to a nonprofit organization because it gives us the opportunity to understand where the organization is situated inside of its environment in relation to its competitors, to its the people that it serves, to other stakeholders, to government entities, to private entities. You get a bird's eye view of where the organization is and where it could be. And the strategic planning process is helping you get from where it is to where it could be. So all of that to say, these tools are relevant and applicable wherever you are and whatever you kind of envision your role within a nonprofit to be. A volunteer, it allows you to help um, kind of understand the support that you can give to a nonprofit, even as a volunteer or as a board member. So I encourage you, continue to think about these tools and where you can start applying them now, even with the organizations that you're a part of. All right. So the first chapter that we read for this week was on completing your strategic plan. And this has been something we've been going over. We've been looking at from the perspective of an organization, how you work on a strategic plan if you don't have one or if you need a new one. And there were five sub-steps that are helpful that I wanted to pull out and just touch on briefly here as we're looking at this idea of finishing a strategic plan. So the first sub-step here in completing a strategic plan is to summarize strategic decisions and agree on core strategies. Now, this was really helpful, and I know I keep referencing back to the strategic planning process that my organization just went through, but it's because it's fresh in my mind, and there were a lot of things that came up in that process that relate back to what we've been talking about and what we've been learning. But as the organization that I was a part of finished its strategic planning process last year, about a year ago this time, the one of the most challenging or interesting parts was gathering consensus as a document was being finished up. It was summarizing the strategic decisions that had been reached through research, through conversation, through listening sessions. That was all put into draft language, and then it gave the planning committee, but also other stakeholders like our students and our faculty and our staff, a chance to agree on these core issues, these core strategies that we were adopting to move forward. And kind of spoiler alert, but not everyone agreed on them at first. And that's normal in an organization. There's going to be disagreement. There's going to be a disagreement that ranges on kind of the whole spectrum from misunderstandings that kind of spark a disagreement, right? So I'm thinking of some situations where um, there were misunderstandings because people didn't fully understand the plan. Um, Maybe it wasn't communicated clearly. Maybe they hadn't taken the time to read all the materials. There was a bunch of ways that misunderstandings could seep to the surface. Um, but that was one area where disagreement came was because the direction, the document was misunderstood. And that's helpful to understand because then it allows you to redraft the language that was misunderstood and try to clarify things, right? Gives you some insight on how you can create this strategic plan in a way that hopefully addresses or eliminates that misunderstanding. But then another piece was of disagreement came from just being in a fundamentally different position. It wasn't that there was misunderstanding; it was that there was a disagreement on how we as an organization should proceed. And for us, we had some areas where that was the case, right? I'm not going to share all of the details, but there were some key important places where the organization was changing and it had to respond to its moment. And that meant change. And there were some people in the organization that didn't like that idea. And that's still something that has to be wrestled through and journeyed in. And that's the way it is with any organization that's going through a strategic planning process. Often you're going to have the disagreements that come from misunderstandings, but you're also going to have these disagreements that come from a different vision of what the organization should be. And that can be based on a lot of different things. And I appreciate how the book talks about going and getting to agreement, finding those places where people are uncomfortable and leaning into them, because you don't want to be doing that work of leaning into those, you know, a year into the strategic plan where you're trying to do implementation. You want to try and address them in the planning process itself and get buy-in from people, even if it's uncomfortable in that moment, so that it's clear where we're going and people are, understand that hey, we're going to have to compromise a little bit in this process. We hear you and we've made a decision, and are you able to live with that, right? And the process I was recently a part of, our executive leader did that, leaned into some of this discomfort. And the other organizations I've been a part of, the leader has done that or not done that sometimes. And when it's not done, it can be really damaging to the organization, because you have people who haven't bought into the strategic plan. They have these disagreements, but maybe they felt like they could never fully express them. And so they kind of just disappear, or as you're trying to implement, they quit or they stop attending or whatever it is. The quiet quit, right? That's a term that was going around for a while here, where people continue to show up, but they're not really invested in the organization anymore. And if you lean into some of those disagreements, then you can clearly convey why the organization is choosing what it's choosing, and you can give them an opportunity to um, get on board if they want to, or leave, right? Like there is some value in that, and it's really important for being able to move forward. I do also appreciate the book points out that consensus is not necessary, like 100% consensus. You're going to have people who do disagree with parts of the plan, and it's really practically impossible to make sure that everybody's happy with every element of the plan. But what you do need is a functional kind of consensus. It's not actual consensus. You're not looking for everybody to agree with everything, but you are trying in this step to make sure that everybody understands where you're going and is able to get on board with that, even if they don't agree with it. There's enough in the plan that they do agree with. They care enough about the organization. They understand where things are coming from, that they're willing to suspend their disbelief and get on board with the program. And that's the kind of buy-in that's needed. Not complete consensus, but an understanding of where the organization is going and an acceptance of that, right? Another piece here is drafting the complete strategic plan, and this is fun. So after you've gone through all this process, you've kind of confirmed all the pieces. You actually have to put it into language that can be um, consumable. And one of the decisions is this an internal document or is this a public facing document? And that will impact the kind of level of edits that you do and the level of the kind of language that goes into this sort of plan. Um, the strategic plans for the organizations that I've been a part of recently have all been public, which means that we were often taking the language that we had developed and workshopped, and we were heavily refining it for public consumption. And that does make a difference, right? And it makes a difference on where you post it in the end, where it lives, formatting, which we'll talk about in a moment. Um, the next piece is a thorough review process. So once you've created draft language, you go through edits, multiple rounds of edits. For us, we did 3 or 4 rounds of edits, starting kind of at the executive level, and then moving into multiple rounds of small language changes from our board, from staff, from faculty, from the committee. It was enormous, the amount of editing that took place. And because we're the sub-organization of a larger organization, we even had to coordinate with that organization as well. So there's another piece there that happens. And the review process is not just for edits in terms of like spelling errors or commas. It's also to make sure that it aligns with the other organizations you're associated with. We actually have 2 organizations that are kind of parent organizations for us. And so we needed to go back and have those leaders review the document. And we had to review it in light of what their positions were and what their mission statements were. So there was a lot of complexity there. Um, Finally, is to begin to prepare a document for public distribution. This was firmly in my court as the director of marketing and communications. I was responsible for formatting it, making it look pretty. And I am a graphic designer, but you don't have to be a graphic designer to be able to do this. You can do this in Canva, and there's some great templates out there that can help make this kind of document really easy to read and really something that's accessible if you're choosing to publish it, especially for public consumption. We worked with a printer then to print a bunch of copies. Uh, I'm laughing because the process for us was a little complicated. We finished a strategic plan a year ago, and then our parent organization went through a huge rebrand, which impacted us. So we redesigned this document to try and align with their um, new branding guidelines and logos. So it can be complicated, but it's something that really this finished a document when you're formatting it and preparing it for public distribution. It's a chance to tell your story, your organization's story in a really compelling, visual, tangible sort of way, right? You can hold a booklet like this when it's published, and it's a chance to really convey your branding guidelines, to have a tone that is consistent with your organization's tone. The copy is consistent. It can really showcase the best of your organization and what you do. And so, if you're ever in this place where you are responsible for a strategic plan, don't let this piece slip by you. This number four, this preparing the document, it's not just um, an extra or something that can kind of be uh, you know, skimped on, because this is an opportunity to tell your story in a compelling way. And in some ways, it kind of sets the model and leads the way for the way that you tell your story in the future. If your strategic plan doesn't set the tone for that, then it's going to be really hard to later go back and say, oh, well, we want to be more hopeful or we want to be more professional or whatever the case may be. So it's a good idea to let your strategic plan reflect those things. All right, then finally, reflect and celebrate. You've come a long way. It's not just a woohoo, pat ourselves on the back sort of thing. This is actually important for the organization itself to recognize this milestone and to make a lot of noise about it, right? To say, we've got this awesome strategic plan. It is going to meet the needs of our community. It's right in line with our mission. This strategic plan is worth celebrating, right? So whether it's a party, a release party, a really awesome email message, we did like a dedicated website with lots of quotes, and we've had multiple kind of meetings and kind of celebrations around this, and it's even impacted our strategic plan has impacted like some of our major celebrations throughout the year, like our commencement and graduation and other things have been built around this theme that we adopted. And so it's a significant moment, and it's important to be able to look at it and be able to celebrate that. So um, another couple pieces here that stand out in this chapter are the idea that absolute consensus is not necessary. We've talked about that, but SMART goals are also important here. As the plan is being drafted, it's important to build in SMART goals. These are specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time-phased goals. And you'll hear that acronym a lot in the nonprofit world, SMART goals. It's often how strategic plans are brought from this broad conceptual level down to a place of action. How do you see these take shape and come to life? Okay, moving here into the last full chapter of the book, the how you use this plan successfully. You've created a strategic plan, which was a huge effort, a big process. It takes time to get there. How do you use it? So the book covers a little bit of this with talking about managing change, developing annual implementation plans and budgets, drafting an overall dashboard to track progress, developing ongoing monitoring and evaluation systems to monitor inevitable course corrections. These are all really important pieces. And I think the first piece, the managing change, it starts as you're in the process itself, right? You're going to see things that come to the surface as you're creating a strategic plan that need to change. And you're going to have to start pushing on them in the strategic planning process itself. And as you move from the planning process to the implementation process, it's important to recognize those areas that need continued pushing and continued renovation or change. And again, leaning into them, like we talked about in the last um, slide, it's challenging and it's hard, but it's really important. And I think that there are systems to help you manage change in important ways. It's helpful to recognize that large scale systems based change does not happen overnight, and people need some time to adjust to it. But when you have systems in place, your strategic plan being one of them, that map out that change over a long period of time, you can phase in that change in a way that's palatable, in a way that people can accept and kind of get on board with. We continue to be doing this kind of change in our organization. And it's not always easy, right? But it's something that's important and it takes time. Developing annual implementation plans and budgets, right? So we've talked about from the beginning of this strategic planning process that strategic plans have a life cycle to them, right? They have an expiration date. Often they're 3 to 5 years long. And when you have finished a strategic plan, that's not the end of it. You also need to create annual implementation plans. How is this being brought into reality on a year-to-year basis, on an annual basis, so that you can judge performance based on that, right? And create budgets that pull at these goals and push at them. And this is a big process to break down the strategic plan into annual chunks and into funding numbers too, right? Because you have these big goals, but they cost things to implement, right? If you're wanting to create new programming to meet an underserved population that your organization has not been able to serve in the past, that has dollar figures attached to it, right? It has staffing that might be needed. So you need $300,000 to provide staffing for this initiative. It requires an investment in a facility in the neighborhood that you're wanting to serve. It requires has programming costs associated with it. If it's a food bank, it requires maybe buying fresh produce or things like that. Or there's 100 other things that go into it. If it's a youth services program, there's costs for programs, for crafts, for the kind of activities or special speakers you might bring in. It starts to mount up. And those goals have to be attached back to the dollars that it takes to implement them. Right. And that's not just at the organizational level, that's at the unit level as well. All right, drafting an overall dashboard to track progress. This is a way of being able to look at where you are and where you're going. Developing ongoing monitoring and evaluation systems. This is similar to the dashboard, right? It could be incorporated in something like that in some ways. I use a tool called Asana. I may have talked about this before, but it does something really close to this where you can have goals that are overarching that you track your projects and your tasks against as you complete them over the course of however long you've set for those goals. It's really helpful, actually, to have that as a dashboard. Um, there are a lot of things that will hit a plan once it's put into action, right? When you bring these ideas and this, um, really, in some ways, this thing that you've birthed into the world, this strategic plan, this thing that you've created and probably took blood, sweat, and tears, when it makes contact with the real world, things change and things go wrong. Um, and an organization, as we've seen, like with the habits of a highly successful organization in the last book we were reading, organizations that can adapt to this and change and grow are going to be more resilient over time. And the strategic plan is so helpful, so important, but it's not all there is. It has to be able to morph and change if circumstances change. When the pandemic hit in 2020, organizations that had strategic plans had to ditch some of the things that were in those strategic plans to be able to adjust to the moment. If you were an organization that was doing in-person programming, that all went out the window. And you had to be responsive and nimble, but it is possible. And a strategic plan, even in those moments of extreme change and shifting, still has value because it gives you somewhere to start. It gives you a place to push off of and to be able to address the moment. So, thank you for going through this section with me. I really appreciate it, your time, and I hope this is valuable to you because um, strategic planning, it really sets apart organizations. It really creates a dividing line between organizations that are effective and aware of their community and those that kind of are just doing what they've always done. So um, I hope if you ever have the chance to use this, that you will. And whether you do the executive piece of strategic planning or not, it is so important as a member of an organization to understand how these things work and how they impact the work we do. Take care and let me know if you have any questions. All right.